All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. My name is Ella, and I'm the communications manager at the network. We are an intelligence-driven counter-human trafficking organization, and our primary focus is human trafficking in the illicit massage industry. Some of you may know that we held a national convening in January, and this webinar series is a follow-up to that. We'll have sessions, this is actually our final week in this webinar series, so thanks for being here, and we'll have one more session tomorrow as well. You can find more information on our website, www.thenetworkteam.org. You'll see that there's a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen for you to submit your questions throughout the session, and we'll stay on for about 15 minutes at the end to answer those. Today, our panelists are Kathy Liu, Supervising Staff Attorney at Sanctuary for Families. It's a leading service provider in the New York area for victims of gender-based violence. Kathy is also the co-founder of the Immigrant History Initiative. And we also have Jenny Yip. She's our senior advisor here at the network. They're here to expound on racist and historical roots of the illicit massage industry, as well as the disproportionate victimization of Asian American and Pacific Islander women. Thank you both for being here today. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ella, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So I'm Kathy, I'm one of the co-presenters. I am a supervising staff attorney with Sanctuary for Families. And as Ella noted, I'm also the co-founder of the Immigrant History Initiative. So I am a huge history nerd, and today's presentation is going to be a little bit unique in the sense that we're actually going to be bringing a lot of history into this space. So before we begin, I just want to take a quick moment. Maybe this goes without saying, but I do want to give a content warning for a lot of what we're going to be sharing today. Given the topic of trafficking, we may be covering some content that people find triggering, including some graphic depictions of racial and sexual violence. So if you need to take a break, please do whatever you need to take care of yourselves. So to jump right in, we're here today 2 years later in remembrance of the shootings in Atlanta that occurred in March 2021. So during those shootings, 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian women whose names are on the screen. 2 years later, we can look back and kind of reflect on the context in which these murders occurred. We had been in the midst of several years of anti-Asian violence across the United States. And what the Atlanta shootings, I think, really made clear was the intersection between racial violence and gender-based violence that deeply impacts Asian women from all walks of life. So today is an opportunity for all of us to come together to learn some of the history that has shaped today's racial and gender dynamics that led to the Atlanta shootings, and also talk about different ways that anti-trafficking advocates like ourselves can step forward in the current day. So I always feel like conversations like these are really important to have, especially ones that center around history, because history can really illuminate a lot of the more insidious forces that lie beneath the surface. So I have here on this slide, the picture of the shooter from the Atlanta shootings. And much of the initial press coverage of the Atlanta incidents, if folks recall, which included official statements from the investigating sheriff's office, a lot of this coverage really focused on the shooter's own testimony, which was on the surface race neutral, meaning that he didn't explicitly touch upon topics of race. What he did talk about was things like sex addiction, right? Being tempted by these Asian women at these massage spas. And he really emphasized that he was not motivated by race. And this was an interpretation that the sheriff's office was kind of running along with, at least in the beginning of the investigation. In reality, his race neutral statements actually demonstrate how deeply wound and how insidious the impact of these racial and sexual dynamics can be. And these dynamics are some that over history have made AAPI women particularly vulnerable to certain types of violence. So this is exactly what we are going to be discussing today. How did we get here? So before I dive in to the history, I do have a poll for all of you. We're trying to keep things a little bit more interactive. You could call this a poll. You could also call this a pop quiz, but don't worry, none of your responses are being recorded. None of you are being graded. So just take a couple of moments to read through these options. When was the biggest wave of Asian migration to the United States? Option 1, in the mid to late 1800s, especially as slavery began to be abolished and the US needed other forms of exploitable labor. The post-World War II period, also for labor needs. The 1970s and 80s, in the form of refugees coming out of the US military conflicts in Southeast Asia. Or today, as globalization makes travel easier and cheaper. So Ella, I don't know how the responses are looking. I would advise folks, don't take too much time to think about how you want to respond. This is just a quick check for prior knowledge.
We have about 70% of participants who have completed the poll. If we want to just give a couple more seconds to see if anyone else would like to answer.
Sounds good.
Okay, we have 38% that chose the first option of the mid to late 1800s, 30% who voted for post-World War II, 14% voted for 70s and 80s, and 16% for today.
Interesting. Okay, so it sounds like the winning option was the first option in the mid to late 1800s. So this is actually a great answer because this is when the first major wave of migration occurred. Now, I do have to say, this pop quiz was a little bit of a trick question because the answer is actually the last one, today as globalization brings us closer together, purely because of the way that the world's population has exponentially increased. So the sheer volume of people traveling from place to place all across the world has simply increased so much that today is the biggest wave that we're seeing. However, the mid to late 1800s is also a really good response. And those of you who might know some Asian American history might have seen how many of the responses to that pop quiz really corresponded with major time periods in Asian American history. So number 1, 1700s to 1800s, really the period of the early migrants from Asia. And they were coming to the US in large part to fill labor demands. And this was primarily immigration by men. So this continues until the mid to late 1800s, until the era of Asian exclusion begins in full force. So this era is really marked by horrifying levels of racial violence, as well as explicitly racist rhetoric from politicians and leaders of that time period. So you see xenophobic movements targeting different groups of Asian immigrants, ranging from the Chinese and then moving on to the Japanese, Korean, South Asian, and Filipino communities. So really nobody coming out of this unscathed. And this was also institutionalized in US immigration law, as we saw law after law being passed to stem the tide of Asian migration to the US. And this continues until the 1950s to 1960s, culminating in the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Anyone who is an immigration attorney in this room will know this act very well. This is the cornerstone of our modern immigration system, and it ended a lot of the racist nationality quotas that were in place that restricted immigration from places like Asia, as well as Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean, essentially any place that was not a Western European country. And then finally, in the 1960s and 70s, US imperialism in Southeast Asia led to the displacement of millions of refugees, which led the US to start changing its refugee laws and resettle a lot of Southeast Asians across the United States. Okay, so that was a really whirlwind crash course in the overall trajectory of these major waves of migration we're seeing from Asia to the United States, to really just kind of set the stage for what I'm going to go into next. Because what I really want to zoom into today is the aspect of gender in all of these centuries of history. So I mentioned earlier that the first big wave of Asian migration to the US took place in the late 1800s. And these were for labor needs that were heavily manual labor. So we would see things like the transcontinental railroad laborers for the Chinese, Japanese and Korean laborers going to places like Hawaii to work on sugar plantations, South Asian men working in mills and farms, oftentimes in the Pacific Northwest. So as a result, migration was really gendered at this time, by which I mean it was primarily men. There were very few jobs for women, and it was also very difficult for Asians to establish families during this time period. There was a lot of discrimination and unequal treatment. And what you begin to see happen is a lot of states beginning to pass a litany of laws that restricted almost every aspect of these migrants' lives, ranging from where they could live, what they could do for work, as well as who they could marry, very importantly, which directly impacted the ability of Asian Americans to establish families. A lot of states had anti-miscegenation laws, which didn't allow Asian people to marry white people, and there were very few Asian women there at the time. So a lot of these early communities weren't permanent. They were often called bachelor societies that you might see on the screen, bachelors because these men were lifelong bachelors who never had the opportunity to marry. I will note here, there are some exceptions to this rule. Certain early Asian Americans were able to live and intermarry with other communities of color, as this was oftentimes a type of interracial marriage that wasn't as heavily policed as those between white and non-white people. So all of this is to say that there were very, very few Asian women in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. And because of this lack of Asian women, there was very little known about them. And instead, they were viewed through what you might call an Orientalist lens, right? One that saw these women through exoticism and a kind of fascination with the alien. So on the screen, there is a picture of a woman named Ah Thong Moi. Ah Thong Moi is known by historians as the first recorded Chinese woman in America. And she was active from 1834 to 1847, and her job was literally to sit in these Chinese, quote unquote, saloons and show white audiences different aspects of her Chinese identity. So she would show them her tiny bound feet, she would demonstrate chopsticks, all of these types of things that white audiences were really fascinated by because it felt so different from what they knew in America. And I think what is particularly telling about Ah Thong Moi's story is that after she finished with these exhibitions, she eventually ends up with the P.T. Barnum Circus, right? A very famous early circus, as what one might call in an un-PC way, right? One of the quote unquote circus freaks, because she was seen as something so alien to the population. So that brings us into the mid to late 1800s. And this is where you start to see the US federal government taking a more active role in the restriction of Asian women from coming to the United States. So we have another pop quiz here. I'll give folks a few moments just to read through the options. And Ella, how are the numbers looking?
We have 45% who have participated, climbing quickly though.
And I know many of these options may seem attractive. Just go with your gut instinct for the one that you think might be the most important factor.
Okay, we're at 73%. If anyone wants to give a final answer. All right. So the results of this one, we have 18% who voted fear that women would bring children and drain the economy, 32% that they believed Asian women were prostitutes and would harm US morality, and 50% wanted Asian immigrants for hard labor, which they believed women were too weak to do.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ella. So it seems like there is heavy consensus on this question for the last option, which is that they wanted Asian immigrants for hard labor. I would say this is very much a factor at play here, right? Because women were not seen as economically valuable per se as Asian men. However, the second option is actually the one that was the explicit justification for US government restrictions on immigration. And this manifested in a law called the 1875 Page Act. So the Page Act, passed in 1875, actually predates the much more famous 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. However, we almost never learn about it in school. The Page Act is one of the first major anti-Asian laws in the history of America. And what is really interesting about it is that the impact of the law almost exclusively targeted Asian women, but it becomes the first step on the road to total Asian exclusion. So Asians of all genders, not just women. And what is also, I think, for this group very interesting about the Page Act is that it is one of the first federal laws on anti-trafficking. There are clear connections to slavery here. This bill is passed in 1875, so it's not long after the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery in America. And so you can see that this bill is really concerned about the quote unquote importation of people into the country against their will, right? Something that might form a new slave trade. So there's a very moralistic tone to the bill from the very beginning. But what it actually becomes known for is the almost complete prohibition it becomes on the immigration of Chinese women. And this is because of a section that is further down in the bill, Section 3. This outcome is quite interesting because Section 3 of the bill is actually race neutral, meaning that the race isn't specified in the actual text of the bill. So Section 3 states, in short, that the importation into the United States of women for the purposes of prostitution is hereby forbidden, period. So there are several assumptions being baked into the text here. First, about how prostitution is being imported into the United States. It's being seen as a foreign danger that is coming from other countries rather than being homegrown. I think this is an idea that many of us on the call could find counterexamples for. But secondly, there is also a very clear assumption about who these prostitutes are. This law itself doesn't specify the race of these women, but the way that the act turns out to work is that it almost exclusively targets Asian women who are coming into the United States on the suspicion that they're prostitutes. And I really want to highlight this because at this point, the stereotype that most, if not all, Asian women coming to the United States are prostitutes is by this point mainstream enough for this kind of logical leap to be happening again and again. So ultimately, the Page Act is a smokescreen. And what I mean by that is it was a way for the US to start test driving Asian exclusion using the language of anti-trafficking and prostitution. The Page Act was actually the brainchild of a man named Horace Page, who was a US representative from California. And he was absolutely obsessed with prohibiting Asian immigration. He openly used racist stereotypes to defend his policy initiatives. And he also authored something like 7 different anti-Asian laws that all failed before he finally hit the jackpot by using this anti-trafficking prostitution angle. So as we discussed, the text of the law seems to be primarily concerned with preserving America's moral and racial purity. And it plugs into a whole discourse at that time about morality and public health. So not only are these Asian women unclean morally, right? They're also spreading disease across the populace. And the effects of the Page Act were wide-ranging. Some historians have compared it to a mild form of ethnic cleansing, simply because it was so effective at preventing the formation of Asian families or the birth of US citizen children who might have a right to stay in this country permanently and have a right to vote and really shape the direction of this country. And by the numbers, you can see the Page Act was actually extremely successful. By 1882, about 40,000 Chinese were migrating to the country. This is before the enforcement of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And out of this 40,000, only 136 were women. That's about 0.3%, when before the enactment of the Page Act, we were looking at numbers closer to 7 to 8% of total migration from Asia. So this caused some historians to remark in an off-color way that the Page Act was so successful at preventing Chinese women from immigrating and consequently keeping this very skewed gender ratio that it paradoxically encouraged the very vice it was supposed to be fighting, which was prostitution. Okay, so to zoom back out a little bit, the Page Act was passed during a very violent and sustained movement against Asian immigration from the 1850s all the way into the mid-1900s. And these mass anti-Asian movements had a very explicit goal of dehumanizing Asians or portraying them as less than human. Oftentimes, there were stereotypes used to show them as disease-ridden or pest-like. And these same words were used in places like the US Senate floor, where senators were debating whether or not to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And I think a lot of us will probably remember during the COVID-19 pandemic, many of these descriptions of being disease-ridden, of being pest-like, still exist today and oftentimes rear their heads when crises like the COVID-19 pandemic occur. So the Page Act itself served as a good test drive for later immigration laws because it targeted such a marginalized community, not just Asian immigrants, but specifically Asian women within the larger community of Asian immigrants. And it also intersected with other issues that had a wide public consensus, like prostitution and anti-trafficking. So 7 years after the passage of the Page Act in 1882, the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, the first immigration law to prohibit almost all immigration of ethnicity or race. And this becomes the first major federal legislation that begins to build the giant immigration mechanism that the US has today. Because prior to this point, the US had what you might think of as something close to open borders. The federal government wasn't really regulating immigration at all. And in fact, many of the states had taken to trying on an ad hoc basis to do something about immigrants that might have been flooding into their borders. Following the Page Act and the Chinese Act, there is a barrage more of anti-Asian exclusion laws. Was only meant to last 10 years, but it continued to be renewed until it was made permanent in 1902 under the Geary Act. And the immigration laws just got more and more restrictive. I'll draw people's attention to the 1975 Immigration Act, an Asiatic barred zone all the way from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. And then finally, the 1924 Immigration Act, which some historians have called the most racist immigration law in the history of America, because what it did was set up quotas for different nations, focusing on immigrants that were not from Western Europe. So the goal of the law was to keep all of the demographics of the United States the same so that Western European immigrants would still have a healthy majority in the United States, so that the United States would not become any more people of color. The quota that was set for Asia was 0. So I have kind of taken people through a whirlwind again of early migration all the way through Asian exclusion. And we're heading more into current day. So I have another poll for everyone. What assumptions or stereotypes have you heard about Asian women today? This poll question is multiple choice, meaning that you can select more than one. So feel free to select any that you have heard associated with Asian women.
And Kathy, I'll let you know when we get to around 70%.
Perfect.
Okay, that's 70%. If we have any final submissions, please do so now. Okay, thank you. So the results of this poll, 90% docile and quiet, 60% exotic, 54% sexually promiscuous, and 43% deceptive and cunning.
Thank you, Ella, and thank you so much to everyone for participating in this poll. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and close the gap between how we got from Asian exclusion to a lot of these stereotypes about Asian women that we still see today. And in order to do that, we are going to look at the intersection of US imperialism and the hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women. For much of the 1800s and 1900s, Asia's interactions with Europe and the US were mainly through colonialism. So relationships that had a very skewed power dynamic. And I want to zoom in a little bit here on a quote from a famous historian and one of the founders of post-colonial studies, Edward Said. So Edward Said was very interested in this idea that he called Orientalism. And he said that Orientalism was a, quote, exclusively male province, where the women of the East are depicted as creatures of a male power fantasy. And so this very kind of concept of Orientalism is inherently gendered, at least within Edward Said's theoretical framework. And this very much stems from what he was seeing during this time period, right? As Western governments were largely ruled by men, and the military occupations that were occurring in Asia were largely also staffed by male soldiers. And Edward Said goes on to say that, quote, when women's sexuality is surrendered, the nation is more or less conquered. So I think this statement on its own feels very problematic, right? And I think he's drawing a very clear equivalence between territorial conquest, right? Military conquest and sexual conquest. And it was because many of the writings during this time period directly characterized the East and countries in the East as inherently female in a way that the West was inherently male. And so there was this idea that Western countries were kind of plundering Asia for its wealth and other resources. And this kind of territorial conquest was analogous in many people's minds to sexual conquest as well. And this is something that I think, like on a theoretical level, feels a little bit shaky, but also turned out to manifest in very concrete ways as these military occupations continued to grow. So to give people some more concrete examples of exactly what I'm talking about, in the late 1800s, and especially the early to mid 1900s, the US engaged in several military conquests in Asia. So I'm going to focus specifically on the United States here, although of course Europe and many European countries were also at play. So you'll see the colonization of the Philippines starting at the end of the 1800s on through World War II, the Korean War, and then the many different conflicts that the US had in Vietnam that also spilled over to surrounding countries, including Cambodia and Laos. And the pattern that you keep seeing over and over again is that as the US military entered these regions and began building up this kind of military industrial infrastructure, right? Building up these military bases to house these soldiers. At the same time, it also drove the growth of a massive sex industry where Asian women were used to cater to the sexual needs of US soldiers in that area. And so again and again in records from these military occupation bases, you see Asian women in that area being described in very graphic, sexual, and dehumanizing terms. And you also see a sharp increase in sexual violence, particularly sexual violence that occurred with impunity. So very often you might see soldiers going out and sexually assaulting women around the military bases, regardless of if there was any money exchange, right? Or if that woman was working in a brothel. And very often these soldiers would face no consequences for their actions. So the growth of these military bases in these countries led to very direct impacts on gender and sexual dynamics within the country itself, as these sex industries sprang up in ways that they simply did not exist before these military occupations. And then when American soldiers came back home, very often these stereotypes were brought back, reinforced, and then applied to Asian women of the diaspora or Asian American women. A lot of these stereotypes were particularly clear in Hollywood depictions during this time period, which I will hand over to Jenny to talk about in more detail.
Thank you so much, Kathy. This was such a really great overview of how over this, history, Asian women have been depicted as sexualized and hypersexualized in history. So, and as these wars ended, many American troops came home with their wartime perceptions of Asian women as submissive, as we've seen that poll, sexually available as well. But we know that, the fetishization of Asian women wasn't limited to military zones only. It would also manifest in popular culture, in movies, in films, in plays, in musicals, TVs, operas. That's where we see a lot of Asian and Asian American women depicted as sexually subservient, meek, and exotic. This is why in the 1900s, there were plays like Madame Butterfly, The Good Woman of Sutran, and Miss Saigon. These female Asian characters would often suffer very tragic endings. As in this opera, Madame Butterfly, 1904, a Japanese woman kills herself after her white American lover abandons her and their son. And next slide, please, Kathy. So on this next slide, you will see that in the mid-20th century, Asian women started being seen on screen, in films, and one of these movies is The World of Susie Wong. Susie is this very kind and submissive Asian woman who would do anything for the white man that she encounters and eventually falls in love with. More of these stereotypes, recent examples like Katy Perry, who is dressed in a Japanese kimono to exhibit the exoticism of a geisha at her AMA performance, or the racist song, Asian Girls. And next slide, please. An overly racist and really hypersexualized representation of Asian women can be seen in these most recent movies. Many of you will probably remember the hypersexualization of Vietnamese women in Full Metal Jacket, where the quote, "me so horny," originates from. There's also racial humor about Asian women in Rush Hour 2, or more stereotypes in Sex and the City, and the Austin Powers movie Goldmember. Why am I showing you all this and saying all this? Next slide, please. It's because we have created a timeline that captures the instances where Asian women were represented as exotic, submissive, hypersexualized, and fetishized in popular culture. These stereotypes might not seem very harmful to many of you. Some might think that Asian women should be flattered by them. But what these stereotypes really do, they take away the individuality and the history of each of one of these women. Portraying Asian women as submissive and docile, exotic, continues to deprive all of us, Asian women, of our hopes and our dreams. How can we normalize the structures in place that enable these stereotypes to continue? And we can also no longer normalize our ignorance around which these women live and work in the illicit massage industry. Which brings me to my next slide. What really happens to women working or exploited in the illicit massage industry? And before I start sharing with you my experience with victim workers who have been trafficking in the illicit massage industry, I want to go over the definition of human trafficking. What is human trafficking? Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, and coercion to obtain some kind of labor or commercial sex act. And we're going to dive deep into these 3 elements and see how they manifest in the illicit massage industry. The first element I want to touch on is the element of force. Force in the form of physical and sexual abuse is present in illicit massage businesses. Instances of beatings, physical beatings, sexual assault, and robbery are very common. And so common that so many of them are now making the headlines. We remember last year, the New Mexico robberies that ended up in the murder of 2 Asian women. But let me tell you, these robberies are very frequent. Next slide, please. This is a quote from one of the victim workers I have encountered last year. What she said to me: I tried to defend myself. I kept fighting him back. And then he ran away, taking $100 from me. And this is to tell you that women working in these settings are often robbed for as little as $100, sometimes even raped for that money. The next quote I heard from Ali, who is another victim worker from the illicit massage industry. He beat me up so much. So when I woke up, I didn't know where I was. The nurse came and told me that I was at the hospital. This is what the use of force looks like in illicit massage businesses. The next picture I want to show you is the living condition of victim workers in these settings. This is a picture of a victim worker's on-site living condition. It's her massage bed. This is where she sleeps. This is also where she works. The same place where she is experiencing exploitation, violence, trafficking, is that same place where she's supposed to rest and sleep. And from a trauma perspective, this is a very impossible ask. The next element I want to talk about is the element of fraud. And fraud is a really big piece in the illicit massage industry. Why is that? Because fraud is the way by which traffickers make money. They make money through deception, through false promises, and fraudulent claims. It may look like the promise of a well-paying job, may look like regular working hours, 8 to 5, or a very attractive work contract with medical health benefits, medical benefits, and all that. But this is what we actually see in terms of recruitment. Next slide, please. A typical example of a WeChat recruitment ad. So WeChat is the social media platform where victim workers can connect with their friends and families, but traffickers also utilize this platform to recruit victims and offer them these jobs, false promises. The first red flag from this ad are these 5 to 10 working hours, promising the women that they will not work more than those hours. But the reality is that a lot of these women are working way more than that. They're working between 12 and 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week. And if you do the math, that's almost double the 40-hour work week. A second red flag here is the promise of favorable working conditions and very high tips. And this ad was posted right at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. The reality is that a lot of these women are more exposed because the sex buyers don't want to wear a mask. And if they are not happy with the services, they will not pay, let alone tip these women for their services. And that's another example of how fraudulent some of these, work recruitment ads can look like. The next slide I want to talk about is one of those, I think some of you may know that there are also ads in newspapers, there are ads posted on social media of fraudulent massage therapy schools. They are promising F1 student visas, and that these students don't even need to be present for these classes or don't even need to attend the exams. The reality is that these massage schools, they provide even fake transcripts, some of them, and certificates, but the women have to pay exorbitant fees. And this creates more debt bondage for a lot of them. As they are trapped in this industry, I want to us to reflect on, some of these fraudulent aspect of this industry. Before I move on to the next slide, which is coercion. And coercion is a really big piece in the illicit massage industry. The reason we talk about it is that some of us may not have this lens. The reason I talk about this is some people may think that there's something wrong with this culture, but there's nothing wrong with Asian culture. It is the way that this culture is manipulated to create shame and to traffic these women. That is the problem. Cultural shame is very much present. It's because in a lot of Asian countries like Taiwan, like China, Korea, Japan, Confucianism is a big belief system, and traffickers know how to exploit these Confucian values. Two of these values I want to touch on today are 面子, which is reputation, and face. And the next one is 人情, which means reciprocity. Now, the concept of 面子 is a noble concept. It's about your reputation, your face in the community. It is a shared responsibility not to damage your reputation, that of your family and your friends. And traffickers know this. They know that these women in the illicit massage industry, they would not want to lose face at all. So they exploit that value, that to their advantage. And in terms of reciprocity, traffickers play on this value to have the victims continue working for them and their criminal networks. They will say to the women, now, who gave you your first job in the United States? Tell me who picked you up from the airport. Who helped you secure an immigration attorney for your visa application? Now it is time for you to return this favor. So ranching, where favors and obligations are weighed so carefully, they are like checks and balances, right? You help me, I help you. But they are some of these, favors that are requested from these women are way beyond what you can imagine. So these women feel trapped, and that's how, utilizing this concept of ranching looks like in the illicit massage industry. Next, values that are is constantly exploited is this value of rallied, like endurance. You have to endure. You come from Asia, you came all the way to work in America. You would do anything for your family. You would do anything for your children. So traffickers know that the women will work really hard. They will work really long and late hours to send money back home. So the women will endure. The victim workers will endure for their family. So traffickers utilize this value for their own benefit. And last but not least, I want to talk about this use of threats and of violence and exposure. Threats are very, very common in the illicit massage industry. Traffickers know that victim workers are often undocumented. They overstay their visas, so they will use threats to expose them. Use threats to expose them to the authorities, use threats of deportation to make the victim workers stay and comply. A lot of them really believe that this is going to happen to them. So the greatest fear actually for a lot of victim workers is to be exposed, being arrested, being exposed in the newspapers, and being exposed to the entire community. And that is where we go back to that concept of 面子, which is face and reputation. They don't want to lose face. Nobody wants to lose face. You may ask yourself a lot, like, how would they threaten them? They can walk out the door, they're free to leave. But that's not the case. I know a victim worker I worked with last year who said that when she tried to cross the street to go to a McDonald's, the CCTV camera, surveillance camera could see her. The boss called her and said, go back. I don't want you to cross the street. There are so many ways that traffickers utilize surveillance cameras because the bosses know, they want to know who goes in and go out of these businesses. They want to know who is the sex buyer going in and out? They also want to know if the victim worker is working or not. So when you think about it, if you go to a regular, massage location, do you see any cameras inside or outside of the business? I don't think so. So these traffickers know how to utilize surveillance cameras footage to threaten those women. They really threaten to expose them to their family and their friends through these surveillance cameras. But also, it is so for these women to not have privacy is something else, because I remember one of the victim workers I met at Illicit Massage business. She had to pull me to the restroom because she could not be free to walk anywhere in that business. These are just examples to show you how the use of violence, the use of threat of violence and exposure through those surveillance cameras can be really harmful and scary for a lot of these women in the massage industry. And I think I'm going to hand it over to Kathy to wrap us up. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Jenny. So it looks like we will be ending with some time for questions. So if folks have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. But I'll just take a moment to wrap things up really quickly. I hope that through this history, you can see that you are a part of a long-standing tradition of advocating against injustice. And the good thing about living in the current day is that we have a lot more tools. Trafficking survivors are recognized as victims. They have associated legal protections, including for immigration relief, which as an immigration attorney and as a learner, studier of immigration history, this is a huge win considering how the 1875 Page Act, nominally a bill against anti-trafficking, was the first step to literally half a century of Asian exclusion and the complete prohibition of any migration from Asia to the United States. At the same time, learning this history and learning about many of today's current dynamics, we can also see how deeply rooted these stereotypes are, and that these stereotypes really impact many different aspects of our clients' lives. So I think very clearly they impact the expectations of sex buyers. Very often sex buyers are white or of a different race than the clients that we serve. And many of these sex buyers come into these establishments with pre-existing ideas of what they think Asian women are and what they want specifically from Asian women. And this also ranges to more mundane everyday experiences that our clients might have simply because of their racial and gender presentations. So the Atlanta shootings that happened 2 years ago are one very extreme and very publicized example of what many of our clients already understand as a lived reality for them. So we hope that you can take the information from today's session and use it to maybe rethink how you might be approaching this client population, how you might be presenting certain parts of your client stories to USCIS or other government agencies and beyond, and also how you're just building a more empathetic, a more deeply understanding, and more trusting relationship with your clients.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Jenny, for sharing this history, these stories, and providing such critical context of what Asian women and victim workers in the IMI experience. This officially ends today's session, but if you need to jump, but we will stay on for 15 minutes to answer your questions. Please don't forget to tune in tomorrow for our final session at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The session will be best practices when serving AAPI survivors, and it will include an IMI survivor on the panel. Okay, so our first question is, what do you think brought the initial anti-Asian feeling that influenced the Page Act?
So this is a great question with a very complex answer. I think a lot of factors went into the initial kind of upswellings of anti-Asian sentiment and violence. I think very often we're fed this narrative that still happens today, right, around quote unquote undocumented immigration, which is that these immigrants are stealing our jobs, they're a drain on the economy. And I do think elements of this were present during this time period as well, because so the Transcontinental Railroad was finalized in the mid 1800s, in the 1860s. And so after the Transcontinental Railroad was finalized, there were a lot of Chinese migrants who were looking for other sources of work. And so competition for jobs became fierce, especially in areas like California and other parts of the West Coast, where there were high concentrations of Asian immigrant populations. And so I think from these initial kind of frictions on the economic side, you can start to see these upswellings of anger at Asian immigrants who might have been undercutting wages, or so-called undercutting, right? Undercutting wages, being willing to work for less simply because they were more desperate. But you also see during this time period that at the same time people were quote unquote mad at Asian immigrants for stealing jobs or whatever, there was also a lot of fear around Asian women of that time period. So I don't have this on the slide itself, but there's a very interesting collection of records from San Francisco where they drew a lot of city maps during this time period that very specifically mapped out what different areas of the city were. And so on one of these maps, they map out the Chinatown ghetto of that time period. And the majority of the buildings on that map are labeled as prostitution. And so I think you can see, like, already at that time period, there was a very strong association with anyone who was an Asian woman with the provision of commercial sexual services, whether or not they were actually providing commercial sexual services at these areas. And I do think part of that stems from the fact that these bachelor societies were so prevalent, right? Whenever you have a very skewed gender dynamic between men and women, empirically speaking, there's a higher incidence of commercial sexual services that kind of springs up in that area. And many of these maps that were created during this time period were actually used to justify city policies. So I talked a lot about policies at a national level, but there were some very interesting, in a bad way, policies that were enacted on a local level. So in San Francisco, there were a series of epidemics, and both bubonic plague and smallpox, but specifically looking at the smallpox epidemics, these maps were used to show that Chinese people were specifically spreading the disease more than other types of populations, which I think, you know, you can kind of argue about that logical correlation. But because of these maps, we're able to enact policies that did not allow Chinese people to enter hospitals that were run by the city for other parts of the community. They would be quarantined. Very often their houses would be fumigated. And those of the Chinese that got sick would be forced to go into this like much smaller, almost like shed-like building where they had much inferior medical services, a much higher rate of death, much less hygiene practices, simply because there was so much fear around the Chinese population and the moral, like scientific, health, economic threat that it might pose to US society. A long answer to a short question.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I think we can all appreciate that long answer and providing all of that information to us. We also have just a couple people in the chat thanking you both for such an insightful presentation. Another question, do you feel with social media, particularly TikTok, that it over-sexualizes Asian women with the rise of anime and how it targets gamers and a younger audience that exploits cultures and enhances stereotypes? With the US trying to ban TikTok, do you think that could help prevent these exploitations?
I can answer this. First question, do you think that it would? Yeah, I think a lot of, there's so much, this is a great area, and I think we could have touched this in our presentation today, but where you see a lot of Asian women being hyper-sexualized, you know, over social media, not just TikTok, but there are other platforms out there. Banning TikTok would not necessarily prevent this exploitation from continuing to happen. These will continue to be showing on other platforms, so I'm not sure that would solve the issue. But I know that, you know, with the anime and there's been so much targeting of Asian women, and a lot of women in the Asian community seeing those stereotypes being, you know, increased. So I just want to say that I don't necessarily personally, maybe Kathy, you have another idea about this, but like I don't necessarily think that banning TikTok will prevent this exploitation from continuing.
Yeah, I would agree with that answer. I actually don't have a TikTok account, so I feel like I can't speak very knowledgeably on this question. I guess my thought about it is that ever since the development of the internet, we've seen vast democratization of information, right? Information just being spread on a much larger and a much faster scale than before. And so you start seeing different exposure to different cultures, which I think on the one hand can be a really wonderful thing, but can also lead to the proliferation of much more problematic and potentially sexist, violent, and racist beliefs, which we might see with the rise of these kind of like hypersexualized stereotypes, but also with the rise of things like incel culture, right? And domestic terrorism and things like that. Which is not to say that the internet is bad, simply that I think it's much easier for these types of beliefs to spread.
Thank you both. Our next question is, as sex is a sensitive and taboo subject in many AAPI cultures, do you have any suggestions for how to bring up the topic of sex trafficking to potential survivors and victims? For example, are there better terms to be used instead of sex trafficking, or better approaches for how to frame the issue?
Yeah, I personally, when I've encountered victim workers, I don't mention the word sex at all, or sex trafficking, because that term itself is a little bit foreign to them. Like they would not think that they are victims of human trafficking or sex trafficking. So really taking it from a labor exploitation perspective, like talking about their working hours, talking about any health issues that they may be encountering, because in Asian cultures, it's so taboo, like you've already mentioned. And then as you get gradually to know victim workers and survivors, you would hear about any red flags of sexual exploitation that you may then say, okay, to yourself that this could be a potential victim of sex trafficking. They would not necessarily acknowledge that they are victims of human trafficking. They may see themselves more as immigrant workers, coming to the country and working here. But really talking about sex or sex trafficking is so taboo that I wouldn't even mention it or touch on it. So Kathy, do you have anything to add about this?
Yeah, I think Jenny makes some really, really great points about how these workers often identify. The only thing I would add to that too is that, so as an immigration attorney, I often do a lot of screenings with clients. And so with screenings, it's all about issue spotting. It's all about trying to figure out if there's any basis of eligibility, and you try to be efficient. I would say in circumstances where you don't have as much time with the survivor, although of course it's always good to try to plan for additional meetings, but if it's a survivor that you're simply not sure that you're going to see again, the way that I usually approach it is by using slang that I've heard in the community from other clients that I've worked with. So for example, and I apologize to the network because this is going to get a little bit graphic, but there's like a phrase in Chinese called 打飞机, which is slang for, I believe, a hand job. And so if I use this term with a client, like, oh, has a client ever asked you to like 打飞机? Usually what I get is like a laugh, because they'll immediately know what I'm talking about. And the use of this type of in-group slang, I think, helps to break the ice a little bit. It'll communicate to them in a short period of time that you know what you're talking about, you've worked with this community before, and that you are not kind of judging them for anything that they might have had to do at this job. And so usually I'll get like a, yeah, sometimes they'll ask for it. And then that's an entryway for me to start probing a little bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. I also have just put in the chat the registration link for our session tomorrow, which covers best practices in this industry when serving AAPI victims, that will expound on this answer a little bit more as well. And our next question is, how is prostitution viewed in China today? Is it legal and moral?
Jenny, I don't know if you have any immediate answers. I can answer very quickly, which is it's not legal and it is viewed very poorly. There is a lot of stigma in China against people who provide commercial sexual services. I mean, I think just to take a few steps back, sex in general is very stigmatized to talk about in China. A lot of TV shows and movies in China, there's so much censorship, they can't even really show it in TV shows and movies. And so the idea of providing commercial sexual services is on a whole other level. In the last several years, we saw country conditions reports of practices in China that included having people who were arrested for prostitution be paraded in the streets as a form of kind of public humiliation and quote unquote like education of the community, right? Like, oh, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. This practice, I think, has largely stopped, but I think it's still useful to bring up as kind of an illustration of how stigmatized these survivors are. And there's very little distinction made between people who are more traditionally forced to provide commercial sexual services versus not.
Thank you so much. I believe that finishes our question and answer session, unless anybody has any final thoughts that they'd like to enter. I just want to thank you both again for being here and for sharing your expertise and knowledge with all of us. It is an absolute privilege to hear from you both. And I look forward to seeing all of our attendees tomorrow at our other session. Thank you guys for being here also. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, everyone.